From the KTSM AM 690 studios, it's Talk El Paso with Andrew J. Polk. Follow on Facebook at facebook.com/Talk El Paso. Now here's your host, Andrew J. Polk.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for Talk El Paso, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM. I'm your host, Andrew J. Polk. Thank you for tuning in, however you may be doing so, be it on air, online, live streaming through the free and reliable iHeartRadio app, or joining us over on the various social pages that we're on these days, including Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. Either Talk El Paso or Andrew J. Polk on all those platforms. For the most part here, we are out of the studio here as we have been this whole week, but still wanted to put together some new episodes, some new discussions, some new interviews for you all. I mean, both a mix of familiar topics, ones that we touch on a decent amount, so the ones that I really like to do earlier in the week, but the one we're going to touch on today here is something that has been really living rent-free in the back of my mind ever since I had the opportunity to go and bring you the coverage that we did of CPAC in Dallas over the summer, the first one held in Texas, and was a heck of an experience just overall, and one that I'm very happy and very thankful to the powers that be and our bosses here for giving me the chance to go do it. We played back for you a lot of interviews coming out of that. One that we weren't quite able to do due to a variety of technical and logistical issues was frankly something I was surprised to see when I went there, more specifically a conservative or right-wing response to climate change. And when I say response, I don't mean what you might expect to have or see from that about basically not agreeing with the concept as a whole. That certainly exists, and there were conversations going on there, but there were various groups there that were saying, listen, we have a right-wing proposal for how to address it. And that really intrigued me. Again, we're able to bring you those specific interviews, basically due to equipment failures, but we have had the chance to now sit down and talk with a larger organization, frankly. A lot of grassroots going on when we were at CPAC, but had the chance to sit down and talk with an organization, Republicen, that I'll give them a chance to explain themselves here as we're going to be getting into the next segment here. But just the whole discussion, how it could work and how this might change the conversation is one that really intrigued me, and we're very happy to bring here for you today. So, going to take that break again here real quick, get into that interview. Again, not in the studio today, but still bringing you these new episodes, so you're welcome to comment, just no calls today, and we'll be back after this break with more Talk El Paso here on News Radio 690 KTSM. Don't go anywhere.
From the KTSM AM 690 studios, it's Talk El Paso with Andrew J. Polk. Follow on Facebook at facebook.com/Talk El Paso. Now here's your host, Andrew J. Polk.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here for Talk El Paso, airing on News Radio 690 KTSM. Still out of the studio here today, but now getting into that interview that I was talking a bit about, how I came to the road on it being with Republicen and what that is and what it means. So without any further ado, here is that interview. Enjoy. Joining me now, we have Bob Inglis, Executive Director of Republicen.org. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Andrew. Thanks.
So, out of the experience I had over at CPAC Dallas, I was kind of surprised to see some organizations that were starting to work on, from the conservative perspective, climate issues, because I think a lot of people are, or may have this conception in mind anyway, that the national conversation has been pretty much in right versus left, that there's only really activity and otherwise not much thought besides opposing efforts going on the right side of things. But that is something that you all are very much focused on, changing the conversation and also offering alternatives to. So for people who aren't familiar, Republicen, what does that name mean, and what is it that you all do and stand for?
We're conservatives who care about climate change, and Republicen.org. EN is for energy, entrepreneurship, and the environment. And we think that there's a free enterprise solution to climate change. And the problem is a problem of economics that has an environmental consequence. And it's understandable, as you say, that many conservatives thought that climate change was a liberal cause because it has been dominated by the left and in the language of the left. We're all going to die next Tuesday. The apocalypse is upon us, things like that. And we need to regulate everything, right? That's sort of so we come along and we say, you know what? There's a free enterprise solution to this. All you got to do is fix the economics and the environment will take care of itself. And that's a strong suit of conservatives, is to know solid economics. So we hope to give the conversation in the language of conservatism, which is our natural language at republicen.org. And we think that conservatives therefore can get in the game and have an answer so that we avoid the problem of big government getting it wrong. In fact, we like to say, Andrew, get this right before big government gets it wrong.
Certain argument to be made in a whole lot of spheres about internal efforts before regulation comes in. But it hasn't been something that I think a lot of people, myself included, frankly, ahead of having had some of those initial conversations and initial exposures to even these concepts from this political side of the political spectrum, that how this kind of conversation can even happen. So when you're talking with people about it, besides, when it comes to then offering free market solutions is something that is such a very big concept and often gets talked about in global terms. How do you all then end up bringing that down to an effect? Where does that actually, the rubber start hitting the road?
Yeah, because, really, there are three ways to fix climate change. You can regulate emissions, you can incentivize clean energy, or you can price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels. We're not into that first one, the regulatory approach at republicen.org, because we're conservatives and we sort of break out in hives when you mention the word regulation. It's very inefficient way to do business. But even, by the way, even if we weren't adverse to regulations, we'd realize the limitation of that first approach, the regulatory approach. You can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. And so if you regulate here and they don't regulate there, manufacturers pick up and move from here to there. When they get there, they're going to emit more than they were emitting here. So actually you go downhill on solving climate change. So we're not into that first approach. Second approach is to incentivize clean energy. If I were still in Congress, I'd probably be voting for some of these things, better credits for wind and solar. That'll help us enrich America, clean up our local air. The question is whether the price of that technology will come down enough for the rest of the world to afford it. If it does, great, then you're solving climate change. If it doesn't, you've cleaned up local air in America, and that's good, but you haven't solved climate change yet, because emissions anywhere are climate change everywhere. And so the third approach, saving for last, obviously the one I favor, is just price in the negative effects. And that comes to us from Milton Friedman. We once had an event at the University of Chicago called "What Would Milton Friedman Do About Climate Change?" And the answer from the Milton Friedman Chair of Economics was he'd tax carbon dioxide. And if you go to our website, republicen.org, there's a great clip of Dr. Friedman on the Phil Donahue show in the 1980s. Phil Donahue, for those listening who are too young to remember who he was a liberal guy, and Dr. Friedman was one of Reagan's advisors, and they'd get on and they'd debate. And so Friedman says, or Phil Donahue says to Friedman, "What do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it?" And Friedman says, "You tax it. You tax pollution." And then he goes on to explain how by taxing it, pollution, you make it so that the person who's producing that has to reflect that cost of that tax in its product. And then the marketplace judges the product and probably chooses the cleaner over the dirty, because now those negative effects that are otherwise just dumped on the neighbors or the people emitting the stuff are added to the price of the product. And then consumers, in the liberty of enlightened self-interest, start choosing cleaner because it's actually cheaper than the dirty that's made accountable. And we think that it's rock solid conservatism to go with Dr. Friedman and to go with this concept of accountability. We think it's really the thing that conservatives have to offer in this conversation is don't try to regulate things, just price in the negative effects. It's sort of, Andrew, like the time that BMW came to the 4th District of South Carolina, built a $7 billion plant in Greenville and Spartanburg, South Carolina. We make some very fine cars here. And they told me when I was in Congress, my first time around, they said, now, please don't have South Carolina EPA try to tell us how to paint a BMW. Don't regulate it. Just tell us how many parts per million we can emit. We'll take care of painting the BMW, because they said, I'm sure the fine engineers at South Carolina EPA, but we know better than anybody else in the world how to paint a BMW. It's like 17 coats of paint on the hood of that, the Z3 they were doing back then. Anyway, so that's an example of how, rather than regulating, just give industry a target. This is why ExxonMobil says, give us a carbon tax. Please don't give us a regulation of greenhouse gases, because they can work with the carbon tax. They can work it into the price of their product. But if you try to regulate them, you end up with real inefficiencies.
So that's an interesting concept there. One of the natural questions I think would be coming out of our audience here on this is that by taxing it, that is still a government interference in it in some way. So it may not be strict regulations of guidelines that have to be followed or you'll be fine, but it's another kind of monetary impact coming from the governmental aspect of it. How do you all talk to or respond to that kind of a concept here?
Yeah, it certainly is. And that's what Dr. Friedman says in this clip. He says, if Phil asked him, is there a role for government? He says, yes, there's a role for the government, Dr. Friedman says, because he says, when you're letting somebody get away with dumping into their neighbor's lungs, basically, he doesn't use that terminology, but you're letting them get away with a cost that should be attributed to their product. And once it is, the marketplace, like I say, chooses cleaner over dirty because cleaner turns out to be cheaper. But typically, Andrew, it's like, well, who would want a tax? For goodness sakes, a new tax. What conservative would a new tax? Well, it has two special features. One is you would return all the money from the tax to the citizenry, either by corresponding tax cuts, dollar for dollar, no growth of government, or a dividend of all the money back to the citizenry. So there really is no growth of government here. We at republican.org are not interested in growing government to solve climate change. In fact, we think the small government approach is to, yes, have the government step in and say, okay, we got to attach this negative cost, but we're going to give that money back to the citizenry. Now, our problem right there, Andrew, I will tell you, is a lot of people don't trust the government to do that. They don't think the government will actually give it back. And there are plenty of examples of the government failing to do that. The bridge that was supposed to be tolled until it was paid for, the toll is on 20 years later, the education lottery that was supposed to improve education that didn't. There are all kinds of examples. But what I'd say to fellow conservatives is, if it's not in the four corners of the bill, a corresponding tax cut or a dividend of all that money back to the citizens, don't vote for it. In other words, so it's revenue neutral. That's the first unique aspect of this tax. Second thing is border adjustable. And this is the kicker. This is why it works, because you get the whole world in on solving the problem through the border adjustment. We'd say to China, we're going to collect a tax on your stuff coming to Walmart shelves. They'd probably object in the World Trade Organization. They'd sue us, saying, you can't do that. That's an impermissible tariff. We think we win that case based on precedents in the chemical industry that say, yeah, well, you can have a content tax based on the content of the stuff coming in. And this would be a carbon content tax. If we're right, and it's upheld by the WTO, 24 hours later, China has the same price on carbon dioxide. Why? Well, they just paid, say, for example, in San Diego, a tax on the stuff headed to the Walmart shelves, and the tax got sent to Washington. If they'd collected that tax internal to China, the tax money would end up in Beijing, and those goods coming through the port of San Diego would come through without any adjustment. So 24 hours later, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus in China, not a very fair government, not a very nice government, but they are doggone efficient. 24 hours later, they'd have the same price on carbon dioxide. And then the whole world would be following. And so without any international agreement, no bowing and scraping at the UN, no protracted negotiations, just a bold move by the United States that says, you want to bring stuff into our market? Fine. We're the biggest market in the world. You're going to pay our carbon tax on entry. Oh, you don't like that? Well, do your own. You don't want to do that? Well, keep on paying our carbon tax. We've got a terrible deficit and an awful debt. So please just keep on paying our carbon tax. But pretty soon, every country in the world would figure out, let's do it ourselves. And then the whole world, 7 billion people, would see the true cost of the burning of fossil fuels. It'd be built into the price of all products. And at that point, the free enterprise system would deliver innovation faster than government regulations or mandates or fickle tax incentives. And we'd be off to the races solving this thing.
A lot of technical questions come to my mind out of all of this. A couple of concepts that this deals with also comes up, the whole concept of a tragedy of the commons here, and also a more kind of modern version of that, of being the long tail or the life cycle of a product from creation to eventual disposal, which has not typically been a part of how you buy something on a shelf or part of the life cycle planning for how companies put it out. This is essentially a move in the direction to a more kind of built-in recognition of all of that. Maybe not the tail end of it here, but definitely from the beginning of all of that thing going into the true cost of the product, as it might be put.
Yeah, built in. That's the key. Those key words you just used. Yeah, you want to build in all the cost to a product, right? Make it present that in a transparent, accountable marketplace, because that's when you get innovation, right? I mean, we're conservatives. We don't want to come by your house in January and say, oh, bad boy, you're not supposed to be having a heated pool in January. That's not allowed in this regulation book. We want to say to you, hey, you know what? The true cost of energy is now reflected on your meter. If you want to heat that pool, well, fine, have us over for a pool party in January. But you'll probably decide to drain that pool in January because you'll say, oh, I see now the true cost of heating that pool. Oh, I think I'll drain it. We'll have the party in May, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to make it so you're in freedom to decide, but we think, check this out, Andrew. Do you think that what I like to say, in the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take? That's a conservative concept, right? No free riders, no people stepping off the end of that salad bar without paying by weight what they took off the salad bar, right? If you let people step off the end of that salad bar without paying, well, you'll go back in a week or two and the restaurant will have Thousand Island dressing, croutons, and chopped up iceberg lettuce, because that's all they'll be able to afford to put out on that salad bar. But if everybody pays for what they take and is accountable, then the freedom to choose whatever you want on that salad bar gives you the opportunity to have nice olives and some turkey, maybe, if everybody's paying. But if people don't pay, havoc results. And so it's just a basic concept that conservatives have really understood. It's usually a problem of the left. They don't quite get this idea that, oh no, you got to pay for these things. Yeah, you got to pay. And if you have people pay individually, they regulate their own appetites. If you don't have them pay, then you got to have a guy there with the regulation book telling them, oh, you can't have turkey this week because you had it last week. No olives for you this week. You have every other week you can get those. And so it's just so much more efficient just to have us all pay based on what we take.
If you're just joining us, guest right now is Bob Inglis, Executive Director of Republicen.org, offering right-wing solutions to climate change and associated problems. So we got to take a break right now. So want to talk with you more about some of the implications and also some of the recent events coming here. So we'll be back right after this break with more of our discussion here on Talk El Paso.
From the KTSM AM 690 studios, it's Talk El Paso with Andrew J. Polk. Follow on Facebook at facebook.com/Talk El Paso. Now here's your host, Andrew J. Polk.
All right, welcome back here. Joining us again here is Bob Inglis, Executive Director of Republicen.org, offering the right-wing alternative climate change solutions here. So, Bob, thanks again for joining us here.
Great to be with you, Andrew. Thanks.
Absolutely. So we're talking a little bit last segment about how this, in general, the concept is of offering this kind of solution, this again, right-wing part of the climate change conversation. So you're talking about pricing in the costs here so that then the free market can make adjustments, as opposed to the idea of regulation of, no, there are only specific ways you can do it, basically offering the swath of whatever is going to be available and people still making their individual decisions being one of the major facets here, what you're seemingly talking about. So then how does that actually then get into place? How does the pricing happen? Is it a however much, kilojoules, or, however much production? Is there, measuring happening at sites, or how does that end up actually, how does the rubber hit the road that way?
Yeah, most people would say that it should be what's called an upstream application of this carbon tax. That means at the mine, at the coal mine, at the pipeline. And so you put on a $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide, for example. That would result at the end of that pipeline in a 36 cent per gallon increase in the price of gasoline at your local gas station. Not catastrophic, but significant. And it's curious, isn't it, that ExxonMobil and the American Petroleum Institute say, yeah, let's do that. And the reason is they just don't want a regulatory answer. They want to say, give us, just price it in and we'll deal with it from there. So the price of gasoline goes up by 36 cents a gallon, but of course the price of a lot of things goes up. But if you're like us and you're conservative, you want to say, okay, so the government just collected a $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide, huge amount of money now coming to the federal government. We would say, either cut my taxes somewhere else, particularly the payroll tax, the FICA tax that all of us pay, 6.2% us on our check, 6.2% that we don't see that the employer is paying, unless you're self-employed, in which case you pay the whole thing and you know how much that tax is. It's a whopping tax on the first dollar of income. Cut that tax, put on that carbon tax. The Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans end up better off. And so the other way to do it is to dividend that money, all that money that comes from that $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide, back to the citizens in a check. So like the Alaska Permanent Fund check, if you're a citizen of Alaska, you get a check in the mail for your share of the oil revenues. And so same thing, carbon tax check would come to you. So that's the revenue neutrality part of this thing that's so important to us, is we don't want to grow the government here. We just want to take this step that puts the price in on fossil fuels, so that they're seen by us, all of us, as consumers. And then we start choosing cleaner over the dirty ones. So, for example, we recently had a trip with Maria Salazar, a freshman Republican in the Biscayne Bay in Miami. And so beforehand, we needed to go get some food at the local Publix grocery store. And we went there and we were looking for spoons and forks, and there were some plastic ones. In the future, if we had this carbon tax I was just describing, we'd probably get there and we'd find another entry on the shelf at Publix, which would be wooden spoons, probably made in South Georgia, close by, renewable resource. And they might end up being cheaper than the plastic ones because the plastic, of course, comes from petroleum, and it would now have reflected in it the costs that would come from the burning of all that stuff. And so the beauty is I'd just go there and look at the Publix and I'd see the two and I'd say, here's some cheaper wooden ones. I think I'll get those. And so then you've got the consumer choosing the cheaper that turns out to be cleaner over the one that's dirty. And then the result is, hey, free enterprise moves along. And so that's the exciting thing that we think is coming, is that if you just put the price in and then let the consumer choose in freedom, not tell them you got to know you can't have plastic forks. No, you can have plastic forks if you want them. They're right there on the shelf next door to the wooden ones. Wooden ones are cheaper, but if you want to have plastic, go ahead and buy it. But a lot of us, cheap people like me, will choose the cheaper for sure. And then free enterprise is delivering innovation faster than government regulations ever could imagine.
It's an interesting concept there, and again, true price of things, what we mentioned here, it has been something that has struck me for years now, that the whole concept of a disposable fork, all that goes into it, of, both the unearthing of what goes into it and the petroleum products, to the massive process that goes into mass producing them, to then the transportation it takes to get it there, and something that we use and then just chuck, has always been a little bit schizophrenic in my mind. So the idea of it then have the true cost of all those other aspects reflected in it is an interesting one. And I don't think anyone actually likes plastic forks for that matter, because it's it's the cheap option and it's what we're used to kind of thing. So it's an interesting way you describe it there.
Of course, Andrew, there you go. You're exactly right. It's cheap because we don't see all those things you just talked about, right? It's sort of like some of those costs are dumped on society without accountability for that product. If you make the product accountable and it's on the shelf next door to the ones made by the South Georgia tree farmer who figured out how to make wooden forks and spoons, or sporks probably, it's pretty exciting to create that opportunity in South Georgia, and because it's not like he's being altruistic. It's just he's growing his trees, he's harvesting them, and he's turned them into something that's useful to society, and it produces less stuff in the air. And great, good on him. But if you want that plastic one, go ahead and buy it. You'll probably be paying a little bit more for it. But the rest of us, being cheap, like I say, like me, will probably be choosing the wooden one.
So, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about climate change and the issues in national and international news lately. We've had some discussion on our own program of the entire whole meeting in Glasgow, COP26, international conglomeration there. And honestly, not a whole lot of people, from my perspective, that were totally happy with the results there. Either it went way too far or it didn't go anywhere near far enough, depending on your perspective of it. So I want to ask you about, was anything from your perspective on this issue substantively done there? But then one other thing that did come to mind here, you were talking a little bit earlier about how, international regulation would kind of come through this, or not regulation, but taxation, as a global order essentially emerging in recognition of these costs once they start being assessed. I don't think it was technically part of COP26, but of related efforts where they were talking about kind of a universal corporate tax being applied, maybe internationally, like at a base level, that is something that international and world leaders have started discussing. So kind of on those two subjects relates to what you were talking about with the tax. So first off, just on COP26, Was that useful at all in your mind towards dealing with these issues, or more specifically towards the way that you're wanting to address it?
I hope the COP26 was useful. I wasn't there, but I hope what was happening behind the scenes, and I've seen some reporting about it, so it gives me some hope that this actually happened, is that there was some discussion about how to do this border adjustment that I was talking about earlier.
Mm.
This is the key thing that could be arrived at something like COP 26 or 27 or 28, is to figure out how you can do that border adjustment, because that's where the power of getting this thing to go worldwide is. Again, we can't just do this here in America. That's why climate change is such a devilish problem. It's the whole
Mm.
world. You've got to get the whole world in. If you're just doing it in America, you may as well not do it. I mean, really, you got to get the whole world in to solve climate change. And so the border adjustment is the mechanism that could come from something like COP 26, 27, 28, um, is, is this. And here's an example of it. The EU, European Union, is talking about putting on a carbon border adjustment in 2023. In other words, stuff coming into the EU, they will tax. They'll put on a carbon tax as it comes into their countries. So that's caused Russia, Mother Russia, the organized crime syndicate. I was on the
Hmm.
Foreign Affairs Committee. We used to say it's not a country, it's really an organized crime syndicate. It's caused Russia to talk about doing a carbon tax. Why? Well, because Russia plans on sending a lot of natural gas into the EU through their new
Hmm.
pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline. When it gets to the border of the EU is going to tax it. The tax money is going to end up in the EU countries. But Russia, if they taxed it themselves, would have the tax money in Moscow, and the natural gas would come through that pipeline with no adjustment. And so Russia, the murderous organized crime syndicate, is thinking about a carbon tax because it's in their interest if their big customer, the EU, starts taxing carbon dioxide. And so, wow, what a thing. It just shows the power of that border adjustment. So the thing that I would hope, Andrew, out of something like Glasgow is some progress on how to set that up in advance so that we know how that border adjustment would work, because that's the means by which this spreads around the world and you get 7 billion people seeing the true cost of products, because the price, like you were talking about earlier, these effects that we don't see in the price of products would now be reflected in the cost of the product. Then 7 billion people would be choosing cleaner over dirty because it's cheaper.
Yeah, pocketbook is certainly a very powerful motivator for a whole lot of people here. And so what you're talking about, the backroom part of it and the border adjustment there, again, with also it was more specifically the G20 kind of around this same time talking about that, maybe that global business tax. So
Yeah.
another kind of contributing concept here to how this might work. So with things like that kind of use a rough framework in place, would you see that as being then easier to implement something like this, what you all espouse?
Yeah, because I think what you're doing there is you're trying to make it so that there's some minimum level of tax that countries are using, so that you don't
Mm.
have what's been called a race to the bottom. Um, Ireland did that very successfully, cutting taxes way low and getting companies like Apple to locate there. Um, it's I mean, it sort of worked out for Ireland, but it makes it so that then everybody else starts cutting down, and then you end up in a situation where it's really is a race to the bottom. So that seems to be a result of that G20 meeting, and but it's that kind of diplomacy that could set up this
Mm.
border adjustment. And it is otherwise, if you don't have that diplomacy in advance, setting up the border adjustment is pretty complicated, I got to admit. But if you have good diplomacy in advance of that and say, listen, this is how it's going to work, and we can agree that you know this is how our border adjustment is going to work coming into the United States, and we'll hope that you mirror the same thing going into your country, then you get efficiencies, because we don't want to have this thing create a pile up at the ports. We want to make it so it's efficient, and there are ways to make it efficient. And so that's what I hope comes out of the diplomacy at places like Glasgow and COP 26, 27, or 28.
Yeah, more to come, I'm sure. Again, if you're just joining us, guest right now is Bob Inglis, Executive Director of Republicen.org, or Republicen.org, I should say. Again, that's the site to find information about what they're talking about and their conservative solutions to the issue of climate change. One final thing I want to leave you with is that we have members of our audience that say that why even talk about this, that they are not convinced that there are the impacts there, or if there are changes to be seen, that there is not a level impact to it. What do you say to people who have those kind of concerns?
Two things. One is politically, it's like this. America will take something over nothing when they decide they've got a problem. And the polling data clearly shows that America is deciding that we have a problem with climate change. So for us as conservatives, be sure they will take something over nothing. If we have no solution to offer, they will take the regulatory solution, and we will have a big government mess on our hands solving climate change. So even if you think it's not for real, you probably want to get on the field with in the competition of ideas with an idea about how to do this so that it wouldn't harm things. If you go to our website, you'll see Art Laffer, one of Reagan's economics advisors. You remember the Laffer curve, saying he didn't know that climate change is real. He says he doesn't need to know. All he needs to know is you're taxing income. He says tax anything else. Emissions will do. And so in that 2-minute clip on our website, you'll see him explaining that you could actually improve the economy this way. And so it's the first answer is a political answer. It's just, if it's so like if we're really honest as conservatives, apparently we didn't have a good alternative social security, Medicare or Obamacare, and the country took those things. They're not sustainable. This is a case where we can get on the field with something that really is sustainable, that works, before we get the big government solution. And so that's a political argument. The substantive argument is, it's like this. If you're diagnosed with cancer today, most doctors will say, we're going to cut it, irradiate it, and treat it with poison. Some doctors will say, diet and exercise will take care of that cancer. Well, you're taking a real risk with your life if you go with that small number of doctors who say diet and exercise. They could turn out to be right. It could be that they're right. That's about the situation on climate change. There are a few climate scientists who say, not to worry about it. Most of them really do worry about it. And they're saying, cut it, irradiate it, and treat it with poison, basically. And so, it could be that it turns out that could be that the people who say diet and exercise treating your cancer, maybe it'll work in your case. But do you want to take that risk? Or do you want to just get with the current protocol? We do hope in the future, though, that we're not cutting, irradiating, and treating with poison. We got some pill we can take that alters the DNA. May it be that comes to be. And we'll look back on this time and say, gee, can you believe we used to treat people with poison, chemotherapy, But for now, it's what we've got. And so that's what we've got in climate change, is scientists saying, gee, it's just measurements. It's just data. And people ask me, do I believe in climate change? I say, no, I don't believe in climate change. Climate change is not worthy of belief. It's just data. My faith informs my reaction to that data. I want to be a steward of God's creation, but it's just data. It's just thermometers, and no reason to get in an argument with a thermometer.
Fair enough. All right. Again, guest right now has been Bob Inglis, Executive Director of Republicen.org. Again, offering a conservative alternative to climate change solutions here. So again, that website, republicen.org. So Bob, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, lay out some of these issues and the various complicated aspects of them here today.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for great questions and giving me the opportunity.
I am sure that by this point, the comments probably going fast and furious over on our social pages. Still out of the office here for this week, but let us know what you think. Leave a comment over on our various social pages. We'll be back after this break with more Talk El Paso, wrapping up this day here on News Radio 690 KTSM.
From the KTSM AM 690 studios, it's Talk El Paso with Andrew J. Polk. Follow on Facebook at facebook.com/Talk El Paso. Now here's your host, Andrew J. Polk.
Wrapping things here up for the day as we are still out of the office, out of the studio, but again, thought it was an interesting discussion. Very curious to see what you all have to say about it. Again, thanks to our guest, Republicen, talking about, well, something you just don't hear that often about, and given the increasing conversations being had about it and the events that have happened recently enough, thought it was an interesting discussion. Very curious to see what you all say once we get back in the studio next week, which we will be doing so. Do not worry, just out of town here for this week. But we still have more new, or at least repackaged shows here for you. What I mean by that is that, particularly since this was a topic that originated for me in my notice out of CPAC, there's been a few interviews there and some other recent and big announcements that we have made that I wanted to, well, maybe refocus on, particularly when it comes to the way we have political discussions in our local area, maybe how it should happen, how groups nationwide are talking about it, as well as some of those big announcements we've made on the show about partnerships we've made. So that's what we're going to focus on with you for the last day of this week and our last pre-recorded show before getting live back in the studio. But that's what we like to do, is have these discussions and hopefully spur maybe a thought or two in some of y'all's heads out there. Otherwise, we're going to have to leave it there for today because we're out of time here for this program. So thank everyone who did tune in, comment, not call, but we'll get back to it. Don't worry. We know you all appreciate that. So no calls tomorrow. Don't forget, but back in the studio next week. Thank you for tuning in. Stay safe out there. Look twice for motorcycles when on the road, and have a great evening, y'all. More tomorrow.